questions, we have answers. This is Jane Miller.
And this is Ken Miller. Welcome to our show, all about real estate with Ken and Jane. Well, today, Jane, our topic is land use. And to help us break it down, we have with us Marc Leber. He's a principal of East Point Engineering. Marc, welcome to our show.
Hi, good morning, Ken. Good morning, Jane. It's nice to be here.
Yes, and welcome you to the show. So land use is such an important topic as it relates to real estate. And we are very pleased to have you with us to help explain to our general audience all the complications involving land use. So to get started with, why don't you just give us your background?
Sure. I graduated with a Bachelor of Science degree in Civil Engineering from Drexel University. I returned to school part-time and completed the MBA program at the Rutgers Graduate School. And in 2003, I was licensed in New Jersey as a professional engineer. In 2005, I was licensed as a professional planner. And in 2006, I completed the Certified Municipal Engineering Certificate program. In the early 2000s, I was living in Howell Township. I was appointed as a member of their planning board. And while living in Howell, I also served on the Affordable Housing Committee and the Environmental Commission. I've appeared before both planning and zoning boards throughout the state of New Jersey. I've also provided expert testimony in municipal court as well as superior court for various types of cases. Presently, I am working in the the private sector, where I provide site plan design and projects for a variety of clients, homeowners, as well as land developers, commercial users. We do a lot of restaurant work, schools. We also do environmental permitting. And as you're about to hear, New Jersey is perhaps one of the most regulated states, so there are a lot of rules and complications when it comes to getting a project built.
Right. Wow, that's a lot of credentials. You almost have more letters after your name than in your name. You got the PE, professional engineer, and the PP, professional planner. So please explain exactly what does a professional planner, what does that certification entail? So
really in New Jersey, planning is about compatibility. Really, nobody wants a nuisance in their neighborhood. And State Planning Act, and there's a County Planning Act as well. The origins of that go back almost 100 years. Post-World War II, when the state was expanding and a lot of people were building, there was really a strong need for some sort of a formal plan in place as to where things should go. Today it's pretty much common that we don't like to place industrial uses next to residential uses. The drawback of this is that these types of rules and plans take years to update and are frequently outdated. For example, we work in municipalities where their codes still might permit television and VCR repair, but they don't allow adult daycare. And, these types of permitted uses, they take years to either write out of the code or add into the codes because zoning is something that's governed locally.
Right. The last show we had with us, we had somebody from East Brunswick. We had Steve Phillips, who's on the zoning and the planning board. So he explained that the township is governed by the master plan, which designates what areas are industrial, what areas are residential, what areas are mixed use, R1, R2, R3. So I guess what you're leading at, the purpose for having land use experts like yourself is to go into a town and you may petition them to change something in a case where the regulation is outdated or archaic and not pertinent to today's standards, right? Because if everybody followed the code per se, you would not need experts to go in and wrestle with the township, I imagine, right? That's the whole purpose. If everybody said, nope, it's on the master plan, we're going to stick to this, regardless of whether it was updated 50 years ago. That's what I'm gathering. Is that kind of correct?
Yes. The master plans are very detailed and they cover numerous aspects of, for example, a municipal master plan. You'll have a section on parks and recreation. You'll have a section on land use, which is probably the most convoluted section. Within land use, it talks about perhaps changes to zoning and where certain types of uses should be placed in town. There's also environmental sections that look at constraints throughout the town, including stream corridors and freshwater wetlands and flood hazard areas. There is a utility section of the master plan that talks about the future capacity of both water, sewer, and things of that nature. There's a separate part of the plan that talks about transportation routes, designating which streets are collector streets, which streets are local streets. There's also an affordable housing section, which addresses where affordable housing should be built and placed and how they'll meet the state's requirements to provide the number of units that the town is obligated to provide. And these plans, they're very detailed, but again, they take a long time to update and keep current in New Jersey. They're supposed to be revisited every 6 years, at which time there's usually a series of public hearings and people can come out and express their opinions, as well as they hire other outside planners to draft new sections of those master plans to recommend either changes or maybe to roll back something that didn't work out too well. There's also discussion about redevelopment areas, which is popular in New Jersey, because frankly, right now, the inventory of land is running low. 50 years ago, someone could approach the planning board. They could develop a 200-lot subdivision, couple of plan sheets, paper. It's approved in one meeting and they're out the next week working. Mm-hmm. It's not that easy anymore in New Jersey. There are more interested parties in the process, and there's a lot more public involvement today. So, as these projects come to fruition, you'll see that there's more and more opinion, which inevitably makes things take longer, which we're probably going to talk about after the break about the approval process to give the audience a flavor for how do you get something built in New Jersey.
Right. Yeah, we'd like to get an understanding of exactly like your role in what the role of a project planner is in the whole process, and what the land use, like what your role and scope is. Like, for you primarily work with commercial clients, but you could also work with residential developers. It could be anybody trying to do any type of land use within a municipality, right? That could need your services, right?
People are surprised when we say that we work for farmers. Because, it's assumed that, hey, farming is just a right in New Jersey and there's really nothing to it is with regard to municipal oversight. But farming involves land, and land is highly regulated in New Jersey. So, when farmers want to build some kind of a structure on their property, they fall into the same set of regulations that, a homeowner might fall into, or someone seeking to develop something on their own property. And we really, we work for everybody. Golf courses, they're highly regulated. Industrial projects, of course, schools. We do a lot of work for houses of worship. Mm-hmm. Once again, house of worship, they want to do something on their property. Even if it's something minor, just to add parking, it falls under the same regulations that a developer would have to comply with. So, in the end, if what you're doing involves land, you're either going to need, a team of, an engineer, a planner, perhaps a land surveyor, really to put together really a set of plans for a proposal that can move through the approval process so that your ultimate goal would be to construct what you want.
Right. And you wear two hats, having the PP and the PE designation. Mm-hmm. I guess your engineering background is in civil engineering, right?
That's correct.
Civil. So you can understand then some of the civil aspects of whether the structural or the drainage and things that the typical civil engineer would wrestle with.
Correct. And really there's only two ways a project gets started. The first one is somebody wants to build something, but they don't know where it could be built. Back to zoning, they don't know what zone it's allowed in. They don't know where that zone exists within their municipality. So they only know what they want to build. The other type of project is they have a piece of land, but they don't know what could be built on the land. So, that you have to start off with, well, what is the property zoned for? And, is whatever the zoning applicable on that property feasible in today's market environment to construct something that's a permitted use that could be successful? Mm-hmm. For example, if you have a piece of property that's zoned strictly professional office, right, there might be no demand for professional office. So does that mean that you can't build anything because if you build an office, nobody's going to rent it? Mm-hmm. It might not be economical to build an office, but there might be other uses that are not permitted in the code that might fit better on that location, in which case it would be a use that's not specifically allowed, and you'd have to go before the municipal zoning board for a variance.
Right. And you're seeing that now that you mentioned, I'm glad you mentioned offices, because from my reading on a national level, certainly in Los Angeles, there are cases where they've converted some of the high skyscrapers. They're converting them back to residential use. So I imagine that had to go back before the zoning boards there, and they allowed it because they figured that the office vacancies were around 40% or so. So they just said, you know what, there's no longer the need for these massive vacant office buildings, so let's put them to beneficial use and convert them into residential. So that's just one example of something.
I believe New York City is experimenting with the same scenario. There's a overabundance of vacant office space, but there's a severe shortage of housing.
Sure.
In New Jersey, we have a shortage of residential housing as well. The dilemma here is most of the municipal zoning does not allow for high-density housing. Many of the ordinances are for single-family houses or duplex dwellings.
Mm-hmm.
And it's your business. You know the prices of even what a townhouse could sell for in Central Jersey.
Mm-hmm.
There just aren't enough of them.
Sure.
And that kind of goes back to planning. In essence, when we look at planning and compatibility and what people's number one concerns are in the state of New Jersey, it always comes down to two or three things. One is traffic.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody wants more traffic.
Right.
The second one is stormwater management.
Yeah.
It's widely publicized that there's severe flooding problems throughout parts of New Jersey.
Mm-hmm.
And if there was never another thing built in the state of New Jersey from today going forward, those problems are not going to fix themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So stormwater management is another issue. And then the third is reduction of air, light, and open space. There are many things that are more sensitive today than they were years ago. For example, if you have a 6-acre tract of land that's fully wooded and you need to remove 6 acres of trees, that's something today that is more sensitive to the public than it was years ago.
Sure.
So municipalities have put into place ordinances that discourage, large tree removal.
Yeah.
But, on the flip side, if you're the person that owns the property that has 6 acres of woods, it almost becomes a hardship to development because removing the trees becomes an obstacle to constructing something.
Right. And these are all the challenges that we're going to discuss after the break, because you always, like you said, there's a shortage of housing, but yet you have the traffic concerns, you have the stormwater management concerns, you have the population concerns, you have the existing roadway infrastructure concerns. So there's a balance where people need more housing, but then you have to take into consideration all these other concerns and then the preservation of open land. So it's a constant, I guess we'll delve into that. We're going to take a short break and we'll be right back after these messages. Okay, welcome back to our show. We're joined today with Marc Leber. He's a principal of East Point Engineering. And Marc, please share with our listeners your contact information and tell us a little bit about your firm.
So the office is at 11 South Main Street. That's in Marlborough Township. You can reach me on the phone, 732-577-0180. You can call me if you have questions about something you're interested in constructing, or even a question about zoning or perhaps what's permitted on your property. In general, our firm is basically in the design field, and that includes subdivisions, site plans. We've worked for franchises, national brands. We've done public school work. And we've done capital improvement work for municipalities because municipalities, they have their own issues that they need to solve, and they rely on other engineers to design plans to solve those problems. And really, this is a large field, and no one could do everything. So as part of this, we rely on other professionals, whether that be environmental consultants, land surveyors, lately a lot of traffic consultants.
Mm.
We rely on geotechnical consultants, which analyze the earth to evaluate, the suitability of the soil. And really, every project is its own unique team of experts to really address each and every concern.
Wow. So it really is a challenging project when like you said, if somebody owns a parcel of land and they could come to you and say, hey, Marc, I own this 6-acre tract of land in South Brunswick, off of Route 130. I want to know how I can develop it, if I can develop it, and if so, what are suitable usage? I mean, something. So you'd have to then orchestrate a whole team of experts to analyze that piece of land.
Correct. And we really start on the local level. The first stop is the zoning ordinance.
Okay.
However, there are also codes on the state and county levels that would apply to certain pieces of land. For example, if you're on a state highway, then the Department of Transportation has jurisdiction as well. Believe it or not, the DOT can actually limit what you could do on your property based upon the size of that property. On the other state level, there's the Department of Environmental Protection, which regulates freshwater wetlands, streams, and flood hazard areas. And if you're on the coast, they regulate coastal areas as well. So even if something's permitted in the local zoning code, you might not qualify for a permit from one of these other state or county agencies because what you're doing might not fit within those rules.
Right.
And on the local level, the process could be somewhat lengthy. For example, if you're proposing something that's either a subdivision or a site plan, you have to attend and provide testimony at a public hearing. So a public hearing is typically held in town hall, and everybody within 200 feet of the property will get a letter in the mail that, so-and-so is proposing a project. There'll be a public hearing on whatever date, at which point they could attend and express either their support or lack of support for the application.
Sure. And just to clarify, the public hearing, that would go before the planning board. That would be even if the parcel is approved for, let's say, construction of a warehouse per se. If it's approved, if it's zoned for that, you would still need a public hearing prior to the actual development approval of the planning board for the project, right? Is that what?
Correct. The planning board is the board of permitted uses. So if you're doing either something that's permitted in that zone or you're proposing a subdivision, you would go before the planning board. The zoning board, on the other hand, is really the board that hears applications for single-family dwelling variances. So if you want to build a shed and you can't meet a setback, you go to the zoning board.
Right.
But they also hear applications for uses that are not allowed.
Right.
In which case, the burden of proof is much higher for a use that's not permitted than at the planning board, where it's a little easier.
I see. Okay. So that's a complicated. So getting back to the whole analysis of the land, I guess, where do you start? You have so many different moving parts. You have the DEP, you have possibly the DOT, you have the state municipal codes. So I guess if somebody comes to you, you're kind of like, you're the conductor and you've got to decide, well, we've got to check, you've got to bring in your team of experts. Like you said, nobody can do everything. You can't be this, you need a surveyor, you probably need a wetlands delineation, phase one, possibly. You got to find out, you got to be like a doctor and do a physical exam of that property to see what's it all about, right? Because you have other than looking on the mapping you have, and it's hard, right?
It's certainly become more complex lately. We try and look at the items that would propose the most constraints on the property. But there are rules in New Jersey that actually put property in regulatory areas that people are unaware of. For example, and I'll just be brief with the new flood hazard area rules. New Jersey now regulates flood hazard areas differently than FEMA. So if you are not in a flood hazard area as shown on a FEMA flood map, that doesn't mean that you're not regulated by the state of New Jersey. So there are properties that are now regulated by New Jersey where people don't realize that they're regulated simply because they look at a FEMA map and say, oh, I'm not in the flood zone, I'm fine.
Okay.
But if you're in a flood zone, that's a development constraint. And that could affect not only the area of the property that's in the flood zone, but they also have stream corridor buffers and things that protect the areas along waterways, which could come onto your property, which also is a constraint.
Right.
So we try and look at the big stuff first, and then we narrow down to little things, which is setback requirements,
height restrictions,
design standards, things like that are more minor that could be technical.
Right. I would think also wetlands would be a big parameter. You want to classify for wetlands and then know what the buffer zones are based on the wetland classification, right?
Correct.
There's different buffer zones and setbacks for that. So
100%.
Yeah. So that's the path towards the approval process. And when you get a project assigned to you, again, it depends on the complexity, but it could take maybe 3 to 6 months before you get the application ready to present to the planning board. By the time you do all the investigate, the background site work.
Yes. Between the time that the property is surveyed and the design is complete and submitted to the town, it could take 6 to 9 months to get to a hearing. But even after the hearing, if the project's approved, you're not done.
Right.
And it all really depends on what kind of other agency permits you need. I mean, worst case, you're applying for a new traffic light. That could take 1 to 2 years for DOT review. Other permits are typically 90 days. And really the only thing that can maybe streamline the process a little is right now, even small projects, let's say someone just wants to put a few extra parking spaces outside their office.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's a commercial site plan application. Even though it's minor, it still has to go before the board for a public hearing, even though it's just a few parking spaces. Mm-hmm. Really, what could be done in New Jersey is if there was a way to separate extremely minor projects. For example, you and your neighbor, you want to give 5 feet of your property to your neighbor.
Okay.
Instead of having like a public hearing where you have everybody come down to the planning board,
200 feet, right?
maybe they could do something where there's just a public comment period.
Mm-hmm.
So, like I said, you want to give your neighbor 5 feet of your property. You submit it to the planning director at the town. Mm-hmm. They have a 2-week public comment period for anybody around your property. If there's no comments from the public, they just sign off and, you can deed that land over. Mm-hmm. Because frankly, the smaller the project, the more it upsets the economic balance. And really what I'm trying to say is that if you're proposing an entire shopping center or you're just proposing, an addition on a commercial building, it's the same process. So I think that there should be a way in New Jersey that it's not a one-size-fits-all process, that smaller projects have an abbreviated process and larger projects have a more in-depth process that involves the public.
Right, that's very true. And I want you to talk also about the difference between approved zoning versus change in use. I mean, we have a project that we're working on together. We won't say the details of that, but it's a project that's important to illustrate because it was the zoning code says it's approved for uses A, B, and C. So we had the project where we represented the buyer side. They were using it. It was approved for the zoning use B, which we'll call the buyer who bought it for use B. But the prior use was use A. So what happened though, what a lot of the public probably doesn't realize, and what a lot of the even professionals don't realize, is just because if you look at the zoning code, if there's approved uses A, B, C, and D, if you change the use, if you go from use A to use B, you're not in there could be other complications involving the land based on parking, traffic flow, the whole 9 yards. So if you could talk a little bit about some concerns, using our example in the foresight, what things that could have to be aware of.
There's actually an analogy for this. Let's say you have a use that they present to the town, and they basically explain that, hey, we serve food, we have a bar, we have a small dance floor, and once in a while we have live music. Well, what is the use? Well, they might say it's a restaurant. If that use ceases to operate, somebody else comes in and says, hey, we're the same thing. We have, food service, we have a small bar, we have a dance floor, we have some music. We're the same as the guy that was here before. Well, no, because the second guy might be a dance club or a nightclub, in which case those aren't the same uses. So in essence, the analysis really looks at the change in the operation, whether it be the hours of operation, the amount of parking that's demanded, the number of staff that are needed to operate that use, the types of deliveries that come in to help that use to function. Those types of things they're not all black and white. It's very hard to discern if something is the same as a prior use. That's
why with the consultation with the attorney, we brought you in on this particular project up front, because it was wise to get your input up front, because you don't want a client to make a large purchase and then find out that they're going to have a lot of problems trying to use the property for their intended use. So that's something that it's just a landmine. I mean, if you don't know anything else, you just have to be aware that besides zoning, you got to watch out for the change in use, because you could step on a landmine if you're not careful.
It's a huge risk for someone who's an applicant. And I was involved in a project that was a daycare center, and the daycare center closed, and someone wanted to build an adult daycare center. And they said, "Oh, it's the same thing. It's like daycare and daycare." Well, unfortunately, it's not, because childcare relies on drop-off in the morning and pick-up in the afternoon by parents versus adult daycare that relies on busing. And the staff requirements are different and the hours of operation are different. So it's really not the same use, in which case, if it's not a permitted use in the zone, you have to go in for a hearing for a variance.
Right, which is another complication. Unfortunately, we're out of time on this show, but once again, Marc, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us, and please share your office contact information once again with our listener base.
Thank you, Ken. It's East Point Engineering at 11 South Main Street in Marlboro. You can reach me on the phone, 732-577-0180.
Perfect. Thank you so much again. Please give Marc a call if you have any land use questions. Bye for now.